Well, thank you for having me back. I always appreciate that. I've been giving a couple of talks on each year commemorating the American Revolution. I think I started in 1774. I did 1775 and 2025, and now tonight I thought, oh, Spirit of 76, we'll take a look at that. I'll see you all in 2033, which is the last year of the Revolution. So if you're like me, and I'm a scholar of the American Revolution, I'm pretty tired of the American Revolution right now. Seems to be everywhere. There's a lot of parades, there's a lot of commemorations, a lot of fights over what does this mean? And frankly, I kind of liked it when nobody cared about it, and I could just kind of go about my business and take a look at the interesting lives of dead people, which is what historians do. So I noticed that the title in the talk that was advertised was The Spirit of 1776, and I did this at the last minute, I apologize. It's interesting because people all recognize the spirit of 1776. So I thought I would just begin this with just a question to you. If you could characterize what you, because everybody's heard the term, right? Spirit of 76. And I thought, wow, I wonder how people think about it now. So if you could think of one word that summarizes the spirit of 76, what would you say? My argument tonight, I'm going to give you 2 words, so I get to cheat, but I'm just curious what people think.
Freedom.
Yeah. Freedom, okay. That's exactly what's that? Courage, okay, freedom, courage.
I was going to say courage.
Courage? Yeah. Constitution. Okay, Declaration too. Well, I'm going to talk about some constitutions. Molly. Minutemen, yep. Patriots.
Well, I have to do 2 to make it work.
Oh, that's fair, because I'm going to have 2 in my argument.
Loyalists and insurrectionists.
Wow.
Later, they became patriots.
I see where you stand.
But initially, they were insurrectionists.
Yeah.
All right?
Well, not originally. If you're a loyalist, they're rebels the whole time. These are people who have committed acts of treason. That's interesting. So the spirit of 1776 then is one of insurrection and treason.
Later, they became patriots.
That's
but
a really.
At this point, they're insurrectionists.
And when I gave my 1775 talk, I focused on how the first year of the revolution was actually a British Civil War. And that's tonight I'm going to talk about that transition from a British Civil War to an actual kind of revolution.
It was when I saw the announcement on this, and it said from the Civil War to the Revolutionary. When I said, wait a minute, he's got his dates back.
Oh, no.
And then I realized that when the war started, it was a civil war. Brother and brother, neighbor against neighbor.
Yeah. British people love killing each other over political differences. They had done it in the 17th century. They beheaded the king. They dug up Oliver Cromwell after he was dead. They beheaded him too.
To be a little nicer to the insurrectionists.
Yes.
How about independence?
Independence. I think that's.
They felt they were doing independence.
Yeah. I think that's what everybody thinks of when they think of 1776, the Declaration of Independence. I think that's absolutely key. You know, as I was thinking about this, I went back and I hadn't seen it because I've lived through the 1976 bicentennial, which was, many people here probably have too, not everybody, but it was a different time. And it got me thinking about how in the bicentennial you saw certain images a lot more than you see now. Furniture had all kinds of images, and I think this is one of the things I remember as a kid from the bicentennial, this image. Is everybody familiar with this image? Does anybody know the context of this image? Because I think it does conjure up some of the things that people were saying earlier. Freedom, courage, because it's this battlefield scene. Does anybody know anything about this image? We have these iconic images in art that we all think of in the Revolution. It's a generic battle scene. Yeah, Reed's Hill was the actual hill. All I wanted to point out was this was a New England artist who created this image for the centennial. It's from 1875. This is a 19th century understanding of the American Revolution. And this is kind of what we see with all the celebrations now. This is kind of an embodiment of how people felt, not in 1776, but in 1876. And I think What we're experiencing today is looking at the revolution through the same lens. And what historians would point out is it's kind of a teleological way of looking at the revolution, which is to say that the revolution can be understood by its outcome, what it did. And a lot of philosophers use that approach. I know philosophers who've looked at the text of the Declaration of Independence have taken that kind of teleological approach. I think there's some danger in that, because I'm a professional historian. Like I said, I'm a simple country historian. What we're interested in is, what did dead people think? How did they experience it? Because they can't really speak for themselves, to try to reconstruct the way that people would have understood this event. This is very much, I'm going to begin with this is very much a 19th century cultural construction of what the American Revolution was. You mentioned the Civil War aspects of it. I think it's meant to speak, you don't see any loyalists in there. It's a united image of the country, which is how...
When did the flag appear in, was it in the...
That flag?
Yeah, I mean, when did the flag with the stars and the stripes and the blue and the 13?
Very late and rarely. Not in 1776.
So, I mean, this wouldn't be Bunker Hill then.
No,
That flag.
it's not a historical image.
Yeah.
It's meant to be a heroic commemoration of the past.
But towards like 1783, 82, would that have been the flag they carried?
It would have been one of the flags. It wouldn't have been the only flag. And again, this is a nationalistic kind of memory. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to give a sweeping overview of the entire year, which is always boring. There's always lulls and dull things. So I'll move through it as quickly as possible. I tried to pack in as much stuff as possible, things that people would recognize, the Declaration of Independence, common sense, a few things that you may not be as familiar with, the smallpox epidemic that was raging in North America at the time. And in keeping with what I talked about in 1775, when I talked about the outbreak of the wars as being understood by the people who participated in it as a British Civil War, everybody thinks that there were sharp divisions, loyalists and insurrectionaries, or loyalists and patriots, however you want to define it. But the one thing, and this is what boring historians point out constantly, and what I will argue tonight, for most people, you think, oh, it's a highly polarized society. Most people were just, let's go see how this works out. Let's see what happens. Let's try to live our lives and get through it without getting wrapped up in all these fanatical kind of views. So I want to kind of pay attention to how people might have experienced that, and from what 1776 would have looked like from their perspective. And I'm going to go through a roughly chronological presentation of the year and hit on some big themes. But I will just give you my argument, which I don't have in a slide. If I were to characterize the spirit of 1776, I'm going to give myself 2 words. Anxiety and ambiguity. Everybody thinks that if you take this teleological approach, everybody knew what was going to happen, everybody was united, everybody understood all of these things. That wasn't clear at all. People changed sides over and over again or did nothing. There was a lot of movement. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And 1776 was a very, very uncertain year in many ways. So I'm going to begin in January, and I kind of left off with this in my last talk. And I think in my last talk I started with a global perspective, one of my other talks, and worked my way back to New Hampshire. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to start in New Hampshire, and then I'm going to broaden it out into a broader kind of international and North American perspective. In early January of 1776, most of you probably have celebrated this in 4th of July parades, the province of New Hampshire was the first rebellious colony to write an independent state constitution. And this came from orders from the Continental Congress in late 1775, instructing the provincial assemblies to consider writing new constitutions of government, which is a revolutionary act, reconstructing the government. Most of you knew this, yes, that New Hampshire was the first state. This is well known. You'll hear the explanation. Why is that? New Hampshire, live free or die, damn it. They're always leading the way with freedom. Well, part of this was the historical context of what had happened in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, in 1775, the last royal governor, John Wentworth, dissolved the colonial assembly for what he viewed to be treasonous activities. So the assembly was not sitting through much of the summer and the spring after Lexington and Concord. What people did in the assembly is, even though they weren't in session, they called for towns to hold elections for delegates to an extra-legal provincial Congress. And the model was the Continental Congress, to sort of coordinate resistance. So there is this incredibly awkward period in the summer of 1775 through January of 1776, where there's the royal governor and the official government, and then there is this extra-legal, not really fully legitimate government that's sitting not in Portsmouth, which is the provincial capital, but in Exeter. And the revolutionaries never tired of pointing out, well, this is the will of the people. These are the people that were elected to represent us. If you're actually someone who believes that rebellion is illegitimate, you're not going to vote in that election. You're going to say, this is an insurrection. So there are a lot of people who felt unrepresented by this provincial Congress. What really made New Hampshire's situation unique was that Governor John Wentworth felt so threatened within the province of New Hampshire. In August of 1775, he fled the colony with his coterie of supporters, most of whom were the most prominent loyalists in the Portsmouth region. So beginning in August of 1775, this is awkward. There's no government in New Hampshire. Now, if you're an ordinary person, that is very, very disturbing. That's why New Hampshire was the first to take this up. They had spent the longest period of time with no effective functioning government. And what the provincial Congress was responding to, I think I used this is from Keene Town Records. This was a petition of the town of Keene in December 7th of 1775. I won't read the whole thing to you, you can take a quick look at it. But basically it's saying, we need a government. We need actual laws. There are people who are taking advantage of this situation to execute personal vendettas. There's all kinds of crimes that are being committed. So there was an impetus from below, kind of regardless of politics. We've got to establish some kind of formal government structure. On January 5th, the provincial Congress, which has no legitimate standing as a government, it had already written this constitution, and then it passed it. That's how New Hampshire got a constitution. If you're opposed to this illegal government, were you represented? Probably not. This is the structure of the government. The New Hampshire, at least the first one in 1776, is mercifully short. It's about 2 pages long, and it creates a very simple, straightforward government. The current provincial Congress, which was based on proportional representation at the time, embodied itself into a House of Representatives. It's just us now. We're an official House of Representatives. For the 1776, the House will appoint 12 members of the council, which is effectively the upper house based on distribution from the various counties, and there will be an election the following year. The Constitution leaves the door open to reconciliation with Great Britain. Also, the New Hampshire Constitution of January criticizes, and this is very different than the Declaration of Independence, as all documents had before, the actions of the British ministry and Parliament, not the king. Even though the king had already rejected the olive leaf petition, which I mentioned previously in one of my other talks. The other thing that's interesting, New Hampshire had no governor. That meant when the House was adjourned and the council wasn't sitting and emergencies came up, somebody had to rule with executive authority. So the House created, and this had already happened at the community level in the towns, a state committee of safety. So when the House wasn't in session, the State Committee of Safety had all kinds of power to conduct executive function of government. Does anybody happen to know who the first chair of the New Hampshire Committee of Safety was? He's often called the first governor of New Hampshire. He was the president of the Committee of Safety. What's that?
Langdon?
Which Langdon? There are a lot of Langdons. It's not a Langdon. John Langdon? Good guess. Molly. Oh, sorry. Jenna, you were going to reveal it. Meshach Weir. Does everybody know Meshach Weir? Well, come on over to the Keene State College archives and talk to Brian Buford, because he's doing a transcription of the Weir papers. Weir, New Hampshire is named after him. He is a very interesting character. He was a prominent colonial lawyer, and he was a very powerful figure in the New Hampshire government, especially through his chairship of the Committee of Safety. He was on the Assembly. He was one of the principal authors of this Constitution. There's no known portrait of him. We don't know what he looks like. No known portrait of him. Maybe AI could... Who elected him? He was elected to the provincial Congress by the people who he represented.
And then the
So he-
Congress together elected him?
Yeah, they elected him to preside over the Committee of Safety when it was adjourned. This is a printed version, just the beginning of it. It's a very short. You can see that it mentions the ministries. It does not mention the king. It said the Continental Congress recommended this. We are going ahead and we are doing it. By the way, the other thing that I would point out is, and I'll talk about this just a little bit later, the fact that they had no governor really showed their resentment of executive power at the state level. A lot of people think that that was hatred of the king, and that was not the case. And I can speak to that separately if people have questions about that. North Americans were weirdos. They loved the monarchy. Some of the revolutionaries wanted a more authoritarian monarch to seize control of Parliament to sort of shape American politics. But a lot of people in the colonies were upset with the centralized power of royal governors. So you can see that this is like the pendulum swinging really far towards it's all legislative branch. We'll see that in the other state constitutions that come a little bit later. That happened on January 5th. On January 10th, 5 days later, Thomas Paine anonymously publishes Common Sense. And if you ask Thomas Paine, it was the greatest selling periodical or essay pamphlet in the history of British North America. Generously, he estimated that he sold 100,000 copies of it. Seems to be completely fraudulent. We don't think it was anywhere near that. But has anybody read the entirety of Common Sense or any of Commons? Most of it. That's pretty good.
A bit sometimes.
It's long. It's way longer than the Declaration of Independence. The thing about Common Sense, and Paine was a master at this. Paine was a master propagandist. Common Sense was a text that was meant to be heard. So just because it didn't sell that many copies doesn't mean that it wasn't influential. People who didn't read heard Common Sense or bits and pieces of Common Sense. There's Paine. He was one of the most zealous advocates for national independence. Everybody thinks that he was out front. New Hampshire had already done it 5 days earlier, but he had been working on this for a long time. People like John Adams hated Thomas Paine. They thought he was crazy. They thought he was a radical. He was screaming and begging for independence for a long time, and this kind of galvanized people around it. He's English. He didn't come to North America until December of 1774. The people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is a very different text than Common Sense, they were all born in North America. They were way more moderate and conservative than this Englishman. I'm not going to go over all the arguments in Common Sense. Let me just say a few things about the text itself. First of all, and my undergraduates are always shocked when they hear me say this, it's intellectually incoherent. It's not ideological in any kind of systematic way. It's got a lot of different arguments in it. Some are very powerful, one of the most powerful, and something that the American revolutionary leaders don't want to go anywhere near is he has a blistering attack on the constitution of British government and hereditary privilege and monarchy itself as utterly absurd. And a lot of people kind of emotionally plugged in with that. The leaders, the North American leaders of the resistance movement, were very uncomfortable with that. John Adams absolutely hated and despised it. He's got a lot of different arguments in there that don't really go together. And if you read Common Sense, it's a scattershot approach. It is meant not to appeal to people's intellectualism. This is why Paine was successful at what he did. It was designed to appeal to their emotions and make them angry. And that worked. And he had a lot of different ways of doing that. One of my favorites, which is utterly vacuous intellectually, he said, well, it's absurd for an island to rule a continent. And plus, it's really, really far away. And by that logic, the moon may as well rule the earth. And I would always say to my students, do you want to be ruled by the moon? What's wrong with you? This puts you in these weird kind of emotional places. But what he was doing was, if you don't like that, I've got this. If you don't like this, I've got that. I've got a lot of different arguments. Unlike the Declaration, Paine muses on what American government should look like. I just threw this up here. This is in my own work, something that I'm really interested in. One of the metaphors that I've discovered in my research on loyalist discourse in New Hampshire is that there's a lot of using marriage as a way of understanding the imperial relationship. And the parent-child metaphor has been focused on by a lot of historians. But the husband-wife relationship has not been as closely focused upon. And Paine kind of builds on some of the essays that were being written at the time that were political metaphors, suggesting that marriage should not be an authoritarian patriarchal institution, but rather a partnership that serves the interests, the mutual interests of both parties. And that is a powerful metaphor because it gets people questioning long-standing patriarchal social traditions. Paine plugs into that. He's got a political reason for it, but he plugs into it. If you read Common Sense, the language of it is, it's a separation. This is the most famous line that was designed to be heard. Everything that's right or natural pleads for separation. This is why it's so much more powerful than the Declaration. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. It's a lot better than when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to engage. So he uses the language of a separation. I won't read this entire passage here, but Paine, who wrote an entire essay, metaphorical essay, on marriage in early 1775, he makes the argument in Common Sense where he genders America female as a wife who has been wronged and should take independent control of the family for herself. There are a lot of arguments in here that destabilize a lot of social relationships. This leads me to my argument. When all this is happening in early 1776, there's a lot of contingency and uncertainty, utter uncertainty about what's going to come next. In the pre-revolutionary period, everybody was talking about resist, reimagine social relationships, reimagine marriage, reimagine patriarchal social structures. Once New Hampshire developed its own constitution, guess what its message was to people about the government? The same people who said, resist Governor Wentworth. And it is like a switch flipped. It's in the newspapers, obey. It is your duty to obey and not question the new government. So a lot of people are uncomfortable with this kind of wild swing back and forth. There's a lot of social disorder. Everybody assumes that there's a dichotomy between loyalists and revolutionary. Most people are like, I don't know what's happening. I'm not sure how this is going to turn out. I think I'm just going to take a, well, let's wait and see kind of approach. I stole your image. He's up on the wall. Reed Batcheller of Nelson, who was an infamous loyalist. I won't say too much about him. I've written about him and Ruth Batcheller, his wife. He was infamous. I don't think he looked like, that's a very generous image. I don't know where you got that, but has anybody heard of him before? He's well known as a loyalist. He actually, the Committee of Safety chased him out of his house. He hid in a cave in Nelson for a while, and then eventually in 1777, July of 1777, he joined John Burgoyne's army. That's a long way off. This is what everybody forgets. Between the outbreak of war in 1775 and July of 1777, when he finally fled, he lived at home. And people didn't like him, but he lived there. He declared that he had taken up Gage's declaration that would give amnesty to people who didn't fight. He said, look, I'm just kind of a neutral. And the committee kept trying to convince him, take the oath, take the oath. He was, I'm not taking your goddamn oath. He would swear a lot. He said, well, way worse than that. I won't tell you what he said. And he was obnoxious. He wouldn't recant his views. And he was a very wealthy person who had a lot of sketchy business things going on. I think this is all kind of mixing together. He has two problems. He can't shut up and he can't stop his self-interested activities. He traveled to Quebec in early 1776 and bought some British East India Company black tea and brought it back to New Hampshire, the Monadnock region, because there's a huge black market for it. In fact, I won't go through all of this, but in Fitzwilliam, the Marlborough, the Monadnock No. 5 and Fitzwilliam committees had heard that he had sold tea to this guy, Frederick Reed in Fitzwilliam. And they interviewed Fitzwilliam. He said, yeah, I bought his tea, and if he brings any more, I'll buy some more damn tea. The committee gave orders to arrest him. He was traveling around on his horse with 3 bags of British East Indies Company tea. He struck a committee member trying to escape from them. And when they captured him, there was only 1 bag, and they had heard that there were 3 bags of tea. So, I don't know, I think maybe somebody stole these other bags. There's no other bags. The committee found he had hid the other 2 bags. He's like a drug dealer. He hid the other 2 bags in the bushes, hoping that nobody would see it. What he was hoping to do was conduct his business, and he was particularly obnoxious. Other people were able to, even whatever their political sympathies were, to just be a little bit more reasonable. I think, didn't Alan Rumrell just recently give his talk? So some of you are familiar with this person from Stoddard, Oliver Parker. The committees often would call people in for hearings. And this is kind of Kafkaesque if you read the documents of the time. People are charged with being an enemy to their country, which is pretty vague. And you can see that Parker is saying, well, who said that? Committee said, we're not going to tell you. We're not going to tell you who said it. We're not going to tell you what they said. You just need to come in and defend yourself. So as you can see, no matter where you stood on the spectrum of politics, the committees were a pretty powerful body. So just because somebody signed the association oath, which I know you had an activity with the oath, doesn't mean that they agreed with it. I think most people signed it to like, I want to live my life. In the same time period and later, Batchelor is such a jerk, he threatens to give people smallpox, which was actually an imagined loyalist plot that circulated. In this period, coinciding with the American Revolution, 1776 was a major year in the Great Revolutionary Smallpox epidemic. It began in 1775 in Boston, and it spread quite a bit in 1776. In this early period that I'm talking about, the Northern Army that was retreating away from its failed invasion of Canada, coming through the Lake Champlain, Hudson River Valley corridor, smallpox broke out heavily in that Northern Continental Army, and there were lots of soldiers from New Hampshire. Most of them were rural Northern New Englanders. Smallpox is a disease that you don't get genetic resistance to. You either get it or you don't. If you get it, 2 simple outcomes: death, survival. Survival's good because then you have immunity. Most of these young farm boys who were soldiers, almost none of them had ever had smallpox before. It was like an Abenaki community in the 17th century that's having its first epidemic. This is debilitating to that army. And in many cases, they're sending soldiers home who have smallpox. These soldiers are coming back to Western New Hampshire, Charlestown, Keene. In this period in the summer of 1776 with the declaration, smallpox is breaking out in Keene, and it's not good. It's a bad situation. One of the things that did exist at the time, is everybody probably knows this, it was inoculation, which was developed in West Africa, which is to cut your hand and put some scabs in there, and then you got a less lethal version. Didn't mean you weren't going to die, but you got smallpox. Chances were good you'd survive and be immune. The British Army inoculated people who had not had smallpox. The Continental Army couldn't do that, especially not in 1776, because if you did that, everybody would be out of commission. The whole army would be out of the field. Inoculations existed, but it was mostly rich people who took them under very controlled circumstances. And I just include this local reference because in Keene, 2 local doctors, Gideon Tiffany and Josiah Pomeroy, set up inoculation hospitals that year, offering to the people who could afford it, inoculation. Most people in Keene were out of their minds, because their view was, you're just spreading smallpox. You can see the petition here, the freeholders of Keene. It's just, these rich people are killing us with their inoculation. I have something with Abigail Adams later. In 1775, when she was inoculated, she was recovering, but she still had transmissible symptoms. She went to the theater in Boston. This is why people without property did not care too much for inoculations. This is a massive, if you've not heard of this epidemic, Elizabeth Fenn did some amazing work on it. She followed how it transited all of North America. Here you can see it spreading to different parts of Eastern North America. I'll talk later about the Cherokee people in this same year. You can see the big cluster in Cherokee country there. And this is the more telling one. This becomes, between 1775 and 1782, a continent-wide epidemic that devastates communities on the Pacific coast, the Atlantic coast. You can see it's really heavily concentrated in the field of operations of the American Revolution, but it transits through the Floridas, through the southwest of North America. It eventually hits Mexico City with horrible results, and then it transits across the northern plains amongst the Mandan people and makes its way to Cree people near Hudson's Bay. So Keene is experiencing that. This is a very uncertain time. 1776, trying to just make the case that there's a lot of anxiety at this point. So into that anxiety, over the summer, getting close to the summer, we're headed toward national independence, which is what everyone remembers the Declaration of Independence. I'm guessing nobody thinks of the state constitutions first, but you should think of them first, because the state constitutions were effectively the first creation of independent governments. A lot of political scholars of the American Revolution have made the case independence was achieved at the state level, not at the national level. Now, the Continental Congress was interested in it because of the question of, would there be a quasi-national government? That's really the big issue. But all through the winter and the spring, 13 of the rebellious states wrote independent constitutions. And I have to get my home state in here of Pennsylvania in May of 1776, one of the most conservative states in the Revolution, finally swept pacifist Quakers out of the assembly by threatening them. And once they did that, they could call for a new constitution. And Pennsylvania wrote one of the it's as close to direct democracy as anybody gets. It's repealed. Rich people in Pennsylvania hated it, but it's as close to direct democracy as was imaginable in the 18th century. There's only one house. There's a lower house. There's an assembly. Assemblymen can only serve one-year terms. They have to be responsive to the voters. All of the laws that are debated by the assembly, before they can vote on them, they have to be published in the newspaper so that the people can give their input on it. And there's a lot of other elements. There's no governor. Pennsylvania's constitution was written by Thomas Paine and an obscure school teacher, Timothy Matlack. I didn't include it, but he actually has a portrait, unlike this mysterious Meshach Weir. All of the state constitutions, there are several political patterns that historians have identified: reapportionment of representation, particularly in addressing some of the imbalances from the colonial period. This is actually key. In this period, voting was based on the concept of owning property. To be a full citizen, you had to be a property owner. The threshold varied from state to state. Every state except Massachusetts lowers the property holding requirement. In fact, Massachusetts, for good measure, they actually raised it. They're an outlier. All the other states lowered it for men. I'll talk about the status of women in a moment. Some of the states, including South Carolina, if you can believe it, lower and remove the property holding qualification to hold office. So a lot of poor people are coming into office in South Carolina. A number of states don't have governors, and there's a real restriction on the governor's powers for the states that still have it. They take away the power to veto, which was a power that the colonial governors had. They're very suspicious of concentrated executive power, terrified of it. These constitutions are all revised later to create stronger executives. By the way, the first US Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, no executive branch. Second one, very powerful executive branch. So I have on here anticlimax, the independence that was declared. The chronology of this, I don't want to belabor it because you've all heard this. Congress actually took a vote on July 2nd. Everybody knew that vote was coming. And the structure of how the Continental Congress voted on measures was you could have a lot of delegates. You could have 7 delegates, 5 delegates, 2 delegates. Each colony got 1 vote. So eventually, in that vote, it took a while to get there, on July 2nd, it was 12-0 with New York abstaining. But to get all the delegates to agree was a delicate process. In order to get everybody on the same page in June, Congress created a committee of 5 people to draft a declaration, which wasn't independence, it was just an explanation of what it meant. So it was critical for them what was going to be said about it, how it was going to be said. And quick question for you, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? He's one of the people who has plans in the Constitution. Madison is very young at that time. Everybody wants to say Thomas Jefferson. Here's the iconic image that every American has. It was a committee of 5 people who wrote it, but it was much broader than that. The committee of 5 all had their ideas. Jefferson was the guy basically who had to do all the writing, and then everybody, oh, let's change this, let's do that, let's do this. Oh, I want this piece put in there. Does everybody recognize the committee of 5? Benjamin Franklin, do not trust that guy. John Adams was the other, a staunch social conservative. If you were my students, I'd say, I'll give you an A for the semester if you can name the other 2. But nobody, Larry David just did one of them in one of his sketches. One is from New York, is Robert Livingston. The other is from Connecticut, is Roger Sherman. They're forgotten. Everybody focuses on Jefferson. This was a document that reflected the will of the entire body and was. There were plenty of New Jersey signers. We've all seen the Declaration of Independence. People mindlessly read it every July 4th. They don't think about it. Part of it is that the middle part, the most boring part, you really have to know your 18th century British ministry political history to understand every law that they're criticizing. There's 3 parts to it, and there's 3 key lines. One thing that I will say about the middle part of the text, the body, the historical evidence, all of you have seen this. The king did this, the king did that. This is a big shift. This had not appeared in the writings of the Continental Congress or any of the revolutionary state constitutions. It was a criticism of Parliament and the ministry. In fact, they appealed to the king over and over again. Will you rein them in? This is kind of a statement of finality when they say, you know what, the king's not coming to save us. We're laying it at your door. There's 3 parts. This is excellent. I love this. Like, teach my students in a writing class, have an introduction where you make an argument, have a body of evidence that backs up what you're saying, and then have a conclusion that talks about the significance of it. It has that. The Committee of 5, they were intellectuals. It is intellectually coherent, unlike common sense. It's a lot more boring to listen to if you've ever listened to it. I'm just going to give you 3 quick lines from this that are all significant lines. There's a lot of significant lines. I'll just highlight this. Everybody has seen this, right? It's probably the most meaningful and well-remembered line from the entire Declaration of Independence. Some of you may know where that came from. The committee was drawing on other thinkers. It was coming from John Locke. We know Jefferson read Locke's Second Treatise of Government many, many times. I won't give the history of early modern England, but Locke was justifying the Glorious Revolution of 1688 when Parliament dumped the king and invited another joint monarchy to assume the throne. It was a justification for revolution. The committee is drawing on Lockean thinking. There's Locke's formulation. This is the line. Plagiarism as a concept didn't exist at the time. Otherwise, in my former role as the academic honesty officer at Keene State, I would have gotten this. There was no footnoting. Everybody who was well-read would have recognized that the Declaration was echoing Locke. This was well-established kind of philosophy at the time. You've probably heard this before, but I just wanted to visually show it to you. What's the big difference? Yeah. What's Locke's formulation, which is very careful? Life, liberty, and estate. The protection of private property. Congress decided to go with that. I'll ask you, why do you think they did that? Jefferson did draft that. Shrewd. I think Franklin probably had some input into it too. Yeah, what do you think?
Property referred partly to slaves.
Yeah,
So when you include or exclude property, you're pandering to the South.
except that enslavement was legal in New Hampshire until the 1850s. And it was legal in every state. New York had one of the Rhode Island had one of the largest enslaved populations in North America, but you're right. It would conjure up immediate thinking about the status of the enslaved, who Jefferson, as a matter of fact, viewed enslaved people as property, not as people. Pursuit of happiness, property. Common thinking at the time, everybody recognized these two passages. Do you see the genius of these people? I rarely ever say that in a sentence with founders. Rhetorically, this is a good move.
Doesn't it open it up to everyone
That's it.
rather than just the property owner?
Well, this is the brilliance. They can have it both ways.
It's open to interpretation.
It's open to interpretation. If you're somebody who doesn't own significant property, do you see what the message is?
You can.
In this formulation of government, we will protect you. This is revealing something. So in the introduction, which the framers say is for posterity, you have to understand, they're convincing a domestic audience. When you have to bring people over, what does that tell you about the revolution in summer of 1776?
Not everyone agrees.
Yeah.
Not everybody's on board.
Not everybody's on board. We got to get people on board for this. Now, the last thing that Jefferson, John Adams, Franklin, Livingston, Sherman ever wanted to do was to not say that property was at the center of citizenship. For people who had read Locke, when they read Pursuit of Happiness, you know what their brains registered? Property. So for enslavers, the pursuit of happiness, it's a state. Enslaved people are a state. They're property. By the way, does the Declaration mention enslavement? Here's a question. Did equality apply to the enslaved? That is in the eye of the interpreter. Enslavers, under no circumstances, and even people who weren't enslavers, assumed that it did not apply to them. The other question I'll take up more immediately is, did it apply to women? Quick question for you, did it apply to women? The philosopher Danielle Allen, in her close textual analysis of the Declaration, she makes the argument that in the 18th century, man was a generic use of humanity. I disagree respectfully. She's a philosopher. I'm a historian. Most historians see this as literal, gender specific. I won't belabor the long history of women's experience. For married women who are married, they were governed by the English law of coverture. They lost their independent political identity. They couldn't own property on their own. They couldn't execute wills. That undercut the fundamental reality that women were individuals and were capable of holding political thought, capable of having ideas that were different from other people. I'll just put up a few of the most prominent women, patriots, if you will, if you're on that side. Mercy Otis Warren, a very powerful family, was one of the premier pamphleteers of the resistance movement. Everybody knew Mercy Otis Warren. She was a playwright. She was one of the first historians of the American Revolution and a prominent anti-federalist, thought that the Constitution was a deal with Satan. Here's another prominent, well-known woman on the Patriot side, former enslaved African-born Phyllis Wheatley, published poet. She wrote a poem for George Washington. She met with Franklin in London. She was both enslaved at one point and a woman. It's pretty clear to people that this is a legal construct. Everybody's heard this. But didn't Abigail Adams write a letter and say, please remember the ladies? And then that's all you ever hear about it. So everybody imagines that all Abigail Adams ever said was, hey, while you're at this, we exist. I'm not going to read this, but I'll leave it up here for you to take a look at it. Abigail Adams was a formidable intellectual. And she and John Adams, despite his social conservatism, had a very kind of companionate marriage where he would seek advice from her, and they would talk about ideas in their correspondence back and forth. The part of this letter, which talks about other stuff, that you can take a look at here, and I won't go too far into it, she's making the case using the language of the revolution to argue for women's equality. And she's kind of calling him out. If you believe in this, you have to understand the fundamental tyranny of the coverture laws. You have to reconsider it. Adams' reply, I'll just give you bits and pieces. You probably heard this before. Adams just thought, a lot of historians say, oh, it was just a joke. They had this great marriage where they would joke back and forth and back and forth. They did joke back and forth. And yeah, he begins with a joke, but if you actually read his response, it's kind of chilling. It tells you who John Adams was. He's saying, look, what's happening right now is already loosening the bonds of the social hierarchy. Apprentices are rebelling against their masters. The enslaved are rebelling against their enslavers. This is a volatile situation. Let us not add this. We're trying to control those people without property. This is not something that I want to talk about. And yeah, he's got this lighthearted attitude toward it, but the final sentence is cold. Depend upon it. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Coverture is not going to change. It won't change until the 19th century. I'm going to go back to that line. Same is true of Locke. The use of men is literal. Revolutionaries said virtual representation was unacceptable. If you read Abigail Adams' full letter, she says, we're virtually represented. We don't vote. We're not really represented. Now, a lot of historians would say, well, back in those days, people never took any of this very seriously. It would take our heroic generation to address some of these issues and that things would get better. But the good news was it set the stage for good things to happen. As you can tell with my sarcasm, I disagree with this. If you actually look at the context in which this was happening, Abigail Adams' letter was not an outlier. It was a discussion that was being widely held. Everybody thinks of first wave of American feminism with Seneca Falls, the 1830s. There was a vigorous feminist movement due to Sergeant Murray in the Revolutionary period. And I will show you how seriously these concerns were taken. I'm going to New Jersey. I'm going to reproduce a key passage from the New Jersey Constitution of 1776. And I'll just say, just read the first phrase. This is for voting rights. And there you can see the property threshold, 50 pounds sterling. That's normal. Actually, that's low. For people who were newly naturalized in states like Pennsylvania, it was 100 pounds. Voting was not widespread in North America. It was more widespread than it was in England, which was dreadful. If you read this carefully and you think about it, here's the thing. I should explain the coverture laws. In the eyes of English common law, there were two types of women in this world. There was the woman alone, who was an individual and had legal rights and a separate identity, and a covered woman, a femme covert. A woman who was married is literally a covered woman. She doesn't exist. Now, this Constitution doesn't say women can vote, but if you think about it, what happened? And it did happen. unmarried women with property, of whom there were many, were able to vote in revolutionary New Jersey.
Because it just says inhabitants.
Inhabitants.
Good money.
With 50 pounds.
Did you notice they chose a different word? They didn't say men.
They said inhabitants.
They said inhabitants. So for people who are saying nobody was thinking about this, that this wasn't an issue, it was an issue. People in the 19th century, those bastards, they erased this history. In fact, in the 1830s, New Jersey repealed this element of the Constitution. And they denied, it was in conjunction with their desire to deny voting rights to other former voters, black property holding men.
But this didn't apply to married women because they
Correct.
didn't have any money.
Correct. Correct. It applies to a relatively small number of women, women who never married, women who were widows, and there were a lot of property holding women of all kinds of different social status.
Could be very powerful.
Yeah, and if you had 50 pounds sterling, and we know this because women voted revolutionary New Jersey. So what I'm throwing out there is a lot of possibilities. That's what I find fascinating about the American Revolution. Things could have gone in a lot of different directions. It went in another kind of direction.
How about a woman who became a widow? Could she suddenly?
Yeah, she's a
now
woman
have
alone.
Property and vote?
Yeah, as long as she doesn't make the mistake of remarrying. But if you're lucky, your husband, your second husband will die and leave you more money. I'm going to move into the quote from the second part, which this is the evidence. This is how terrible the British Empire is. There are exactly 27 grievances. Most of them are boring as hell unless you know the Quebec Act inside and out. This is the last one. This is the one they wanted everybody to remember. Number 27. People just glean over it in the readings and they say, oh, that's just the way those people thought back then. What's lurking behind it? What are they trying to address here? That is exactly what it's saying.
Frontiers.
The United States will be an expansionistic empire at the expense of indigenous people. But the way they characterize it, the king is recruiting indigenous people who are, quote unquote, uncivilized in their warfare to use against American subjects. The other thing is he's incited domestic insurrections amongst us. I'll return to indigenous people in just a moment. Does anybody know what that refers to? It's in there for a reason. They don't speak the words. It's just like the US Constitution. But everybody knew. That's their genius. You can have it both ways. In the province of Virginia, the royal governor was still there in 1775. And when he was attacked, he issued a proclamation freeing indentured servants and enslaved people who took up arms with the British Empire, who were enslaved by rebel masters. Now, as you can imagine, everyone in Virginia who wanted to emancipate themselves, my enslaver is a rebel for sure. I heard him toasting Congress down at the tavern. This is just the policy of Dunmore in Virginia. It doesn't become British policy until 1779, and then it does become British military policy, and you don't have to fight. It will apply to women and children. Anybody who comes over to British lines who was enslaved by a rebel master is promised freedom. They don't always get it, but that comes much later, not in this period. Has everybody heard of Dunmore's proclamation? That's what's behind that reference. Everybody who heard that in 1776, when he is encouraged domestic, that's what they knew. That's why the context is important. Dunmore recruited, this is a regular British regiment that fought against the Revolution. His grasp of African geography was terrible. His people were mostly West and West Central Africans, and he called it the Ethiopian Regiment. These are reenactors portraying the regiment. They came up with their own motto, which they put on their sashes. That was not from Dunmore. That's their battle cry, fighting against the Revolution. And if you can't quite read it, it says, liberty to the slaves. Dunmore loved that. Oh, you love liberty? We'll see. Unfortunately, this regiment withered away through the smallpox epidemic and was disbanded. It's not a continent-wide threat yet, but it's growing. And it's in fact the enslaved themselves who pushed this issue. I won't go into it, but it was enslaved people coming to Dunmore who made it an issue. It wasn't like Dunmore. He was a conservative Scot. He wanted to preserve enslavement. It was the actions of enslaved people themselves. This made people nervous. This is one of my favorite. This is from 1776 in November. This is a really interesting passage that I found in a Pennsylvania newspaper, and it's worth just taking a quick look at. And this explains the mindset. I doubt that this actually happened. There's nobody fact-checking 18th century newspapers. My guess is, and it has all the hallmarks of it, this is revolutionary propaganda. And it's not just in Pennsylvania. If you look at the newspapers are full of the dangers of the enslaved liberating themselves. For people who didn't care about issues of parliamentary sovereignty, do you see what you see what the revolutionaries are doing? If you care about enslavement, no matter what side you're on, you had better think twice about which side you pick. And for people who weren't enslavers, and that's why I think this story kind of represents that, you didn't have to be an enslaver to see what this represented. A threat to the whole social hierarchy, to the patriarchal order. Look at the language that's being used. It's very specific, and this is why I'm pretty close to 99% sure it was revolutionary propaganda. Stay, you damned white bitch. This is meant to appeal to the popular prejudices and the convergence of race and gender. And the use of the word white is ominous. And the revolutionaries start to conflate the revolutionary cause with the cause of white people, whoever that is. Franklin in the 1750s basically said, if you're German and you're not from Saxony, you're not white. If you're French, you're not white. If you're Swedish, you're not white. So the term was contested, but there it is. What's emerging in the newspapers, because they're also talking about the threat of indigenous people, and I'll talk more about that. Most indigenous people were not in the war at this point. They're just it's just rumors and fear-mongering. What they're doing is they're creating an appealing image based on fear of the social hierarchy being turned upside down. You may not agree with us on everything, but this is what we will represent. And increasingly, this language of whiteness and white male citizenship defines people of African descent and indigenous people as outside the bounds of possible citizenship in the Republic. And I can say this, for this was the case in Pennsylvania. There are oaths of allegiance to the new constitutions. A lot of states, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, they say all white men, regardless of whether you have property or not, even if you can't vote, you've got to take the oath. That suggests that the only people with political subjectivity is white men. If you're not a white man, you're outside the bounds. That's pretty explicit in some of the state oaths. I want to show you New Hampshire's. Now, this is not the oath. This is who it applies to. New Hampshire doesn't use the language of whiteness. They use the language of exclusion. And it just comes out and says, people of African descent don't take this oath. This is kind of akin to Dred Scott. In colonial America, black men with property could vote. The Dred Scott case, Roger Taney said, it was never the case. It is historically incorrect. Here you can see New Hampshire is stripping the political subjectivity of black men. The context of this is, and all the stuff about the horrors of indigenous warfare, well, 98% of indigenous people in North America were trying to stay out of the war. Everyone imagines that you're either with the British Empire or the United States. Indigenous people have history, as I tell my students all the time. They have national interests. They have reasons for doing what they do. Rather than seeing Mohawks as pro-British, I think it was Kathleen Duval made the argument, maybe we need to see the British Empire as pro-Mohawk. That might be another way of seeing it. For indigenous people, they wanted to stay out of this war. It didn't really serve their interests. It would be good to triangulate the revolutionaries against the British. Locally, Abenaki, Wabanaki peoples, mostly for the most part, remained neutral. They traded and engaged in diplomacy with both sides. Peoples of the Ohio River Valley, same thing. One of the most powerful entities in all of North America, the Haudenosaunee Six Nations, even its nation that's closest to trade with the British Empire, the Mohawks, they don't even begin to enter the war until 1777. So that piece in there was false. It was the last thing to conjure up fear. The one exception is that the majority of Cherokee towns, they go to war preemptively with Virginia and the Carolinas to protect their independence. And that has a context. I'll be super quick with this. Their homes were being invaded. And this is true of the Shawnee people a little bit further to the north. Everybody's heard of Daniel Boone. This is Daniel Boone coming into Cumberland Gap with a lot of British colonists who were violating the proclamation of 1763. Daniel Boone was a surveyor, as was George Washington. They were surveying lots for land speculators. Land speculators were setting up land companies in this region. The reason that the Cherokee went to war had nothing to do with what they cared about the American Revolution. It had to do with Cherokee independence. That's the reason for the 27th grievance. We lose sight of it and it's just passed over. Oh, this is outdated. This is something that we got over. This was one of the most powerful parts of that entire middle evidence part. Finally, last, the conclusion. This is what everybody was focused on. We've got to have a semblance of a nation. If we have the semblance of a nation, we can engage in trade, which is important because we need supplies, we need weapons, and we can engage in alliances. As soon as the Declaration of Independence is signed, very shortly afterwards, the United States sends a diplomatic delegation to France. Now, Spain had been clandestinely providing financial support and military supplies through the colony of New Mexico for quite a while. And everybody remembers Franklin as the lead minister. The three original ministers were Franklin, Arthur Lee from Virginia, who Franklin saw as insane later in his career, Silas Deane of Connecticut, who executed a lot of shady deals. Congress recalled him and took a look at that. Oh, and there was another shadowy character who attached themselves to this ministry in France. It was a guy named Edward Bancroft. Has anybody heard of him? Yes? He sure was. Who was he a spy for? See, this is an interesting case. He was a North American subject who was living in England at the time of the outbreak of the American Revolution, and he had been contacted by Congress to be an intelligence asset for the United States, which he was. And when this delegation went to France, he traveled to France and then secretly was helping them. He was effectively serving as their secretary. What historians didn't know until the 1890s, when the archives were opened up, he was a double agent. British intelligence was using him. And Franklin knew that there was an agent working in the delegation, and he said, if my own valet were a spy, it would be fine, because I think the more they do that, the quicker we'll get into an alliance. But he was actually providing intelligence. The British Empire knew what was going on, and they were concerned about it. I can tell you that. This is a major turning point. Real quickly, I won't bore you with the military situation. The military situation for the United States, it's kind of a mixed bag. The invasion of Canada is a spectacular failure. There's the smallpox epidemic in the Northern Continental Army. In March of 1776, the British government shifts its strategy. My 1775 talk, I talked about how the first phase of British strategy was it was a counterinsurgency at a localized level in New England. Britain said, no, this is something different. The British government, the ministry decided what we have on our hands is a full-blown conventional war. We're going to fight it like a full-blown conventional war. We're going to shift everything. In March of 1776, Sir William Howe is named the new British commander-in-chief, and the British Army, under the Royal Navy and his brother, Lord Richard Howe, evacuate Boston and go to Nova Scotia for months. And everybody's thinking, oh, things are going pretty well for us. Main British Army is now out of there. They were building up for military operations, and the military operations would come shortly after the Declaration of Independence. The Howe brothers' charge to fight this war was to get the hell out of New England. It's full of yahoos, as we all know, and to cut the colonies in half with the middle colonies and focus on New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, where they believed there was a lot of loyalist support for the British Army, erroneously. And both of these guys were supporters of the colonial cause in Parliament. Franklin was very close with Lord Richard Howe. And so they have some connections. This is really interesting. You don't see this every day. The British ministry empowered the admiral and the general to engage in a diplomatic settlement. So they were charged with defeating the enemy in battle, but kind of bringing them in. And that's the way that they approach this. In August of 1776, many of you have seen the Ken Burns documentary, so I won't bore you with all the tedious flanking movements and everything. The British land the largest British army to that date. That shows you how seriously they were taking this war. They knew time was running out. They had to do something quickly. 32,000 British regulars and German auxiliaries, damned Hessians. Everybody hated the Hessians. They're in the Declaration of Independence too. Arrived in Long Island. Washington had a total force of 19,000, and I use regular, continental regulars in quotation marks. They weren't very well trained at this point. It was mostly militia auxiliaries. So much larger army. Bottom line is, Washington very much admired the British Army. He wanted to fight like they did. He had served with the British Army in Braddock's expedition, the Battle of the Monongahela, and he stood and fought. And in short order, he was tactically devastated at the Battle of Long Island. Howe occupied Brooklyn Heights, followed by Manhattan. Washington retreated, fights one other major engagement with Howe's army in Westchester County at White Plains, and is defeated decisively. And then starts a glorious American military tradition, which actually I'm being serious, this is a good military tradition, running away. He took the remnants of the army and had to retreat across northern New Jersey. And Howe pursued through October and early November. And by November, the British were in control of New York City and most of New Jersey. Washington crossed the Delaware River north of Philadelphia, and his situation was so desperate because the militia all went home. Enlistments were up in the Continental Army. I think I'm gonna get out of here. I'm going home. The army is about 5,000 effective at this point. And this is when Paine writes his American Crisis essay. When Washington crosses the Delaware, he burns all the Durham boats at the ferries so the British could not pursue, because he knows if the Continental Army is destroyed, the symbol of the revolution will be a devastating blow. It's in this time period, I actually teach a course on war and culture in early America, and it's unusual when you ever hear this. Washington was a poor tactician. Mediocre maybe at the end of his career, good enough, but he developed. He was a flexible thinker, and in military situations, he became a very, very good strategic thinker. It took him a while to get it, but he got it. And nobody got it better than his subordinate general, Nathaniel Greene, Quaker from Rhode Island, who did this in the South. It's actually Greene who's responsible for Cornwallis's surrender. Washington is under siege. This tiny semblance of revolution is still there. And people in Congress are blaming Washington. They're saying he can't fight. We're in trouble. It's all his fault. Let's replace him. Another Continental general, a former British officer, Charles Lee, kind of positions himself, hey, I'll take over and I'm going to fight in a regular guerrilla war. That's the way to fight this. This is how desperate the situation is. At the end of 1776, Richard Stockton is captured in New Jersey. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Charles Carroll, another signer, in July. By December, he says it's time to seek peace on British terms. Jefferson starts considering the restoration of the monarchy. Let's try to get some good terms for representation in the colonies and bring the monarch back. People don't know that. That's the contingency of how difficult this was. There's Lee. He thought he was brilliant. He told everyone he was brilliant. Washington develops his new strategy. And this is what he does it at the Battle of Trenton and then subsequently at the Battle of Princeton. Washington realizes, given my situation, I don't like it, the best I can hope to do is keep the army intact. That means running away when I have to. And later in the war, when the army grows, it means fighting when I have to in a larger battle. He tries to avoid that as much as possible. He develops a strategy of erosion. I will conserve American military strength and peck away at you because you have to restore the union within the British Empire. All I have to make sure is that you don't prevail. And he realizes I can't beat Howe in a major battle, but what I can do is pick off meaningless, tiny garrisons that I can outnumber. And he realizes in very late of 1776, he has to take a chance and do this. And he decides on the German garrison at Trenton, which is very, very small. His plan is to cross the entire remnant of the Continental Army across the Delaware River and surprise that garrison. How many of you have seen Emanuel Leutz's?
Who has it?
It was painted in 1851. It tells you more about the United States and Germany in 1851 than it does anything else. First of all, Leutze, he used the Rhine for crossing this. I have friends in the historical reenactment community who are out of their minds with this image because apparently the boats had to be flat-bottomed Durham boats and they weren't Durham boats and that's wrong and this is wrong and Washington wouldn't have been standing and so forth. The other thing is the river wasn't iced over. It was sleeting and freezing rain. It was bad weather. It was in fact bad weather. This is an allegory for the United States. That's why I'm gonna just leave this go. This is something that tells you more about the 19th century collective memory of revolution. You might notice that there is a man of African descent that Leutze chose to portray there. Does anybody happen to know who that is? It is purported to be Prince Whipple. Prince Whipple was enslaved by William Whipple, one of the signers, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And he served several tours in the Continental Army. And when William Whipple ordered him to re-enlist, he said, you know what? There's only one condition on which I'll re-enlist. I'm going to free myself. And he did. By the way, Prince Whipple was not in that boat. Leutze just threw him in there because he's speaking to the United States in the antebellum period. So anyway, that's the iconic image that we have. By the way, the Hessians weren't drunk. It was Christmas night. It wasn't Christmas Eve. Everybody thinks that the Hessians were drunk on Christmas Eve. They weren't. They just did not believe that Washington would be so foolish as to risk a crossing, especially in such bad weather. He surprised them. He captured a cannon. The commanding officer is mortally wounded. The next day, he marches the few prisoners through the streets of Philadelphia with the captured cannon to show Congress, look, the symbols are still there. They have not defeated us. A couple of days later in January, I won't go too far into 1777, he crosses again and surprises a small British garrison under Lord Cornwallis at Princeton, very tiny, strategically meaningless. The British are in winter quarters in New York City. 18th century armies didn't fight during the non-campaign season. So this is just an annoyance. They reoccupy Princeton, they reoccupy Trenton. It means nothing, but it is a psychological boost. Washington, as a strategist, has come to realize that strategy is not always related to the outcome of big battles. There are politics involved, there's psychology involved. You have to be aware of that. The British government is aware of it. We're headed towards a world war. The British government realizes with the American delegation in France, the clandestine Spanish support for the revolutionaries, it's only a matter of time until this war broadens. In 1778, France does conclude an alliance with the United States. Spain enters the war in 1779, not as an ally of the United States. They refuse to do that, but they fight against Britain. The Netherlands in 1780 and 1781 enter the war in the Caribbean. This is coming later, so I don't want to go too far in this. In the British psyche, it sounds incredible, but if you go to Britain, people see the outcome of this war as a great imperial victory because they view it as a war of imperial survival when everybody was ganging up against them and they managed to survive. The French tried to invade Jamaica in 1782 and that failed. That was probably the most important British victory of the entire war. That's coming later. The British government knows, they know from Bancroft, this is coming. Everybody thinks the next year, 1777, is going to be the decisive year. And so after having said all this about 1776, I'll say it really was. The real kind of outcome of the war was formed in 1777. Last thing I'll leave you with is to remind you that North America is a big place. Loyalists, indigenous people, Dunmore's Proclamation, these are all things that the 19th century collective memory of the revolution consciously wrote out of it. The only country that mattered in North America that was worth studying was the United States. And people in the United States were all united. And the people who disagreed, read Batchelor, got out. Everybody was on the same side. North America is very big. 1776 was kind of a watershed year for a lot of different reasons. It was exactly in this period that the Russian Empire was consolidating its colonial control of the Aleutian Islands to dominate, and this sounds like a small thing, the sea otter fur trade in China is one of the most lucrative trades in the world. It builds the Russian Empire's wealth. And they colonize and bring disease to the Aleut people, fundamental demographic change in the Pacific Northwest. Also in 1776, the indigenous Kumeyaay people of Southern California executed an uprising against the Spanish colonial mission and authorities in San Diego. The other thing that is critical on the Pacific coast is that Spain became so concerned with Russian inroads in the Northwest that they decided to seek a naval base further north. The Spanish colonial town of San Francisco was founded in 1776. Seminole people, everybody think, oh, the Seminole people have lived in East Florida forever. No. Timucua and Calusa people lived there. Seminole peoples were a new people. It was a process of ethnogenesis. Refugee indigenous people created a new nation. Most of them were Muskogean-speaking, usually Creek people, not always. Some people of African descent, Chickasaws. This is a new community. This was very common in indigenous nations to create new nations out of the shards of displacement. So Seminole people are literally just beginning to come into existence. And part of the reason is there are Creek people who want to resist the American Revolution. They see the revolutionaries as kind of expansionistic. The other thing that happens in this period, the Comanches migrated to the Southern Plains. These were hunting and gathering people, and they totally transformed their culture in the 1730s. Everybody imagines the Comanches had been on the Southern Plains forever. No. They lived in the Great Basin region. They totally transformed their culture in the 1730s by adapting equestrian culture. And they became one of the greatest equestrian empires that the world has ever seen in the mid-18th century. In 1776, the Spanish colony of New Mexico and Puebloan peoples who lived in that region, Diné people, were being hit hard by domination from the Comanche Empire. And then finally, this happened in 1776. The Lakota people in what we now identify as Western Minnesota, which were agrarian people, began migrating across the northern plains, where they would encounter Mandan-speaking peoples, like the Hidatsa, other Mandans, and they discovered, their words, the Black Hills. Everyone imagines that the Lakota people have been timelessly attached to the Black Hills. They expanded into it. This is an arid region of North America where rainfall kind of transforms it. It's a particularly significant region. So I just wanted to leave you with this final sort of wider take on this. The United States, the story that everybody focuses on, wasn't the full story of North America. In 1776, there's the Comanche Empire at this time, one of the greatest empires on earth. And this is an artist's conception of the Lakota discovering the Black Hills, which they took through conquest. They made the case to the US Supreme Court in the 19th century that they had a right to it by conquest, like the US. So that's all I have. I figured I'd end on an upbeat note. I'd be happy to answer any questions if people have them. If not, I totally understand. Thanks for coming out on an ominously orange-skied summer evening. It feels like the apocalypse, because I feel anxiety and ambiguity myself, given the sky.
Just curious, if New Hampshire had the first constitution, how come Connecticut's called the Constitution State?
Well, that's because they're referring to the US Constitution. Everybody wants to focus on the US Constitution. Everybody wants to forget the Articles of Confederation, conveniently enough. You know, this is not the first time I've gotten that question. I gave a talk at the, I think it was the Fitzwilliam Historical Society, and someone said that exact same, why don't we have this on our license plate?
I knew the
Yeah,
answer.
yeah.
but it seems that New Hampshire ought to be pushing itself.
They're pushing themselves pretty well. We have the John Stark live free or die thing on our mind. It's a pretty stark dichotomy. No, actually, pun intended. Yeah.
In 1776, was New Hampshire recently split from Massachusetts, or was
That's
that
a good
long
question.
time before?
No, it was relatively recently fully split. The relationship between New Hampshire and Massachusetts in the colonial period is very complex and convoluted. New Hampshire was separate, then it was absorbed by Massachusetts Bay for a long period of time. And then after the Glorious Revolution in the 1680s, after the Dominion of New England was dissolved, New Hampshire got its own assembly, but it shared a governor with Massachusetts into the 1740s. Massachusetts governors presided over New Hampshire, but the lieutenant governor was typically charged with presiding over New Hampshire. New Hampshire, finally, when it had its separate governorship, it had 2 royal governors, and they were both named Wentworth. The Wentworths controlled everything. I mean, they were a rich merchant Anglican family. It was Benning Wentworth in the colonial period and John Wentworth, and both of them New Hampshire born, very shrewd politicians, very good at what they did. Yeah, so it was recent.
I was trying to, why would New Hampshire be sort of at the first to issue a new sort of constitution in a way? And I'm thinking they had recently split from Massachusetts. They threw off some, well, call them tyrants, but they threw off some overlords, let's put it that way. So it was just sort of part of the fabric of the times.
Yeah, and I think it had to do with New Hampshire's particular revolutionary history. The allies of the Wentworths, who were very powerful, they fled with him. So that created a power vacuum. They had a lot of enemies, trust me. Like John Sullivan, other people, they consolidated their power. They wanted them out. They were only too happy to change governments.
One thing I wanted to mention, you brought up your other talks. Those are we have them on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in 1774, 1775, we have those talks available on our YouTube channel.
Can you summarize your 2 words again? I should write them down.
Anxiety and ambiguity.
Ambiguity.
Yeah, people are not comfortable with that. Historians love it, but I think people want straightforward descriptions, and I think it's not clear. There's a lot of ambiguity.
When did the term Spirit of 76?
That's a 19th century invention. The 19th century, in all the commemorations of the revolution, it kind of rewrites it every time, and you can see that happening right now. I mean, it's a way you can look at the Ken Burns documentary as a kind of 21st century revision of the American Revolution. Like the Spirit of 76, everybody's heard of the Boston Tea Party. That was a 19th century invention. Nobody called it the Boston Tea Party in 1774 or 1780 or 1790. It was just the destruction of the tea. Paul Revere never said the British were coming because everybody was British. He said the regulars were coming.
I was just telling Sharon today that I spent some time in England, and I'd speak of the Revolutionary War, and no one knew what I was talking about because they call it the War of American Independence.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've had a few English exchange students over the years, and I've presented my work on loyalists at King's College in London, and I had some British scholars come up to me and say, "Oh, these loyalists that you're talking, I've never heard some of these stories before of them." And I can say loyalists are completely forgotten in the United States. They're completely forgotten in Great Britain. The place that they're not forgotten is Canada, where they're viewed as pretty valuable. But in Britain, the sense that it's kind of folded into the wars of imperial survival in the French Revolutionary period, where it's a series where Britons, their collective memory of who they are, it's a series of British responses to crises. I've had English students and Scottish students in my classes tell me that when they were taught in primary school and then at the secondary level, they were always taught that the American Revolution was kind of bloodless. They were surprised by how much violence there was because in the British telling of the story, they focus more on the international and European elements of it than we do. but they don't really know much about the rebellion. Yeah. Now, I've just slandered all British people, so don't tell anyone.
So I know there was no real poll at that time, but do you have a sense, is there a sense of how many people were loyalists or percentage of the population?
Can you repeat what he said?
Yeah, the question is, since there were no polls at the time, no political action committee saying what to please rate on a scale of 1 to 5, how you feel about the revolution, something like that. How do we know how many people supported each side? Many people have heard this. John Adams famously said, famous because historians have quoted this, it's from one of his letters, about a third of the people supported the revolution, about a third were opposed, and about a third were in the middle. Who's heard that? This is why I always check footnotes. And I try to tell my history majors, check footnotes. If you actually look at that letter, John Adams is talking about the French Revolution. He's not talking about the American Revolution. And historians have repeated it as a kind of shorthand. For many years, people just blindly repeated it. I'll answer your question by just reiterating it. There's no way of knowing, but there is a whole body of scholarship out now. This sounds really exciting. It's about people who were disaffected or neutral, who just didn't really take any kind of side. Sounds exciting. What turns a man neutral? What kind of person is like that? But
Teen Beat magazine.
these scholars are making a pretty convincing case that it depends on how you define disaffected, which is some people would switch sides, they would go back and forth. There was a lot of movement. I would say, and a lot of these scholars have made this argument, there's two extremes, and the number in the two extremes are pretty small. Most people are in between, and there's a broad spectrum in between. And when one side prevails, pretty much everybody is like, yeah, I was with them all along, which makes sense.
But weren't there were a lot of people that right after the end of the war moved to Canada who were loyalists? I mean, do we have any idea how many?
Yeah, we do. We have a very good idea because the British kept very good records of that. The British kept records of people who evacuated with the British Army in 1783 as per the conventions of the Treaty of Paris. New York City was not evacuated until November. It's still celebrated as a holiday in New York, Evacuation Day of 1783. The British kept records in all the seaports that evacuated people, and historians have documented it pretty closely. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60,000, that close to 20,000 of those people were people of African descent. That's where Nova Scotia and New Brunswick's black population comes from. And some black loyalists in Nova Scotia migrated to the new British colony of Sierra Leone, where they rebelled against the British government in the early 19th century, including Harry Washington was in Sierra Leone, one of Washington's enslaved people.
There was the Revolutionary War ceremony in Marlborough, and they were, I guess I wouldn't call bragging, but they made the statement, I think it's called the association test.
Yeah, that was, I showed the provisions of that.
99% of the men in Marlborough of majority age signed it, but you're saying many of them went along to get along, or get along to go along, or whatever.
Yeah,
they weren't really invested in it, but they knew it was in their best interest to sign.
Yeah, that is 100% true. In Nelson, for example, every male resident except Breed Batchelor took the oath. If you might not have seen it, but in my slide, I can go back. There's a provision. This isn't the actual oath, but this is who's liable to it and what the provisions are. Every man, and this is interesting too, I didn't get a chance to talk about this. It doesn't you don't have to own property. So again, white men without, you see what's happening here. White men without property are being brought into the American nation at the exclusion of other people. It's like a Faustian bargain of what's happening here. So any man who is not of African descent or a lunatic or quote idiot is considered to have enough political consciousness to take this oath. The consequences of not doing it is that the Committee of Safety has to report the people who didn't sign it, and that's published. So,
I can add that when we were doing this exhibit, we had a research team, and so we decided to look at that association test. And so we went through every town in Cheshire County, who signed it, who didn't, and then tried to trace what happened to people, or even the general sense of each town. So like Richmond had quite a few people who didn't sign, but there were a lot of Quakers there too. So just what can that tell us by looking at the association test as a starting point for saying what was going on in Cheshire County as a whole? And in the last talk, we talked, one of your last talks, we talked about Hinsdale and this general sense of like ambiguity or not liking what's going on. And then you get to this point where Keene is saying, like, get your house in order. If your wife, your servant, anyone says anything, you're held liable. So like the change in the tone over a year and a half was amazing. But we're also finding, like, you know, there's people who were Minutemen that went off to Lexington and Concord, and then were like, yeah, you know, I'm not for this entirely, and become loyalist. And some were jailed, some just had to stay home. And we found quite a handful that took off to, lost all their property. The state takes their property and they end up in Canada, and they're trying to get it back. So we have the research that we did on this is now on our website. So we have who went to Bunker Hill, and those lists for each town in Cheshire County, but also who signed the association test and who didn't in each of the towns that we still have records for. So if you're interested in just looking at your town, check out the Historical Society website.
yeah, and that's a good thing to cross-reference, because that November 1778 law that prescribed a certain group of loyalists was a very small number. Batchelor was on it. It was, I think, it was like somewhere in the neighborhood of 128. There were way more than 128 people who resisted the revolution. I think looking at the lists of town by town, and I've seen those lists, that gives you a better idea of people who at the outset were kind of questioning.
You mentioned Pomeroy earlier, starting the
he's a
smallpox
loyalist.
hospital. He was a loyalist.
Yeah, he was a loyalist.
So we had been tracking him for another project on the Recovering Black History Project, because he's writing back to Keene saying, can someone please sell my slaves? I need the money. And so there's all of these things that are going on. And then you've got Simon Baxter, another enslaver from Alstead, whose daughter is writing to the state government saying, he's better now. Can he please come home? Can you please give him his property back? And he's sorry for what he did. And so there's these really interesting stories, but it's all unique. And that's why we ended up picking 15 different stories, because there's so much complexity and diversity in these stories and what was going on. So I'm glad you touched on so many of those things.
Yeah, and it's another resource if you're really interested in it. And also, this is the other thing to bear in mind when looking at any primary source document, is that people are aware of audience expectations. So you have to read what the meaning of that signature is through the audience expectations. Because if you do the other end of this, which I have actually also done, is look in the British Public Records Office at the loyalist claims. And then these people who were ambiguous, kind of middle of the roaders from New Hampshire, who eventually leave for England, in their loyalist claims, they are the most loyal subjects in the history of humanity. My love for his greatest of majesties, George III, led me to resist the inroads of the insurrectionaries. They're exaggerating too. So you see a lot of that.
I was just going to ask you, as far as resources you've used, like the stuff you said about Breed Bachelor today, I hadn't heard. Like what sources have really been really fruitful for this kind of research for you?
Well, I have for my New Hampshire Loyalist project, I went to the state archives, and this sounds really exciting. I read all the records of the State Committee of Safety, because if you want to know what's happening in revolutionary Pennsylvania, read the papers of the Committee of Safety, because Meshach Weir and the committee were receiving correspondence and petitions from the other committees. And this, I always talk about how terrifying the committees were at the town level, but on the other hand, that was how the revolution succeeded. That's where you really get a sense of what's going on. And sometimes you'll get petitions from inhabitants from the towns to the committee, and also the legislative records were helpful. In the legislative records, there's a whole box on Ruth and Breed Bachelor. Yeah, that's where I got the drug dealing tea story.
Well, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.